Introduction, Origins and Methodology. In early 1986, Senator John Kerry began a staff investigation of allegations that elements of the supply network supporting the Nicaraguan Contras were linked with drug traffickers. In April 1986, Senator Kerry took information he had developed to the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Richard Lugar, who agreed to conduct a staff inquiry into those allegations. In response to a request by Senator Kerry, Senator Lugar scheduled a closed session of the Committee on Foreign Relations on June 25, 1986, to discuss these allegations and to determine whether or not adequate attention and priority was being given to international narcotics law enforcement efforts generally. Senator Kerry was concerned that because of the preoccupation with other foreign policy priorities relating to several nations, the United States was not dealing adequately with the growing global drug problem. At that meeting, Senator Kerry raised questions as to the willingness of the administration to investigate allegations of drug trafficking involving the Contra supply network and the apparent reluctance to deal with Bahamian drug corruption for reasons of national security. Senator Kerry noted that witnesses who had brought this information to his attention had also allegations of drug-related corruption concerning Nicaraguan officials. In response, the committee, at the direction of the then chairman, Senator Richard Lugar, decided that an investigation of drug allegations relating to the war in Nicaragua should be undertaken. In February 1987, at the direction of Chairman Claiborne Pell, the committee continued its investigative efforts, expanding the focus to include the impact of drug trafficking from the Caribbean and Central and South America on U.S. foreign policy interests. In April, the responsibility for the investigation was given to the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, chaired by Senator Kerry, with Senator McConnell serving as the ranking member. The subcommittee conducted 14 days of open hearings, 9 executive sessions, and received testimony from 27 witnesses. In addition, the staff deposed an additional 20 witnesses. 30 subpoenas were issued, many calling for the production of extensive documentation. The committee sought and received documents from a large number of government agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the U.S. Customs Service, the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and the National Security Council. In addition, the full Foreign Relations Committee conducted extensive questioning of officials on the global narcotics problem in 1987 and 1988 in response to the annual International Narcotics Control Strategy Report. That report is an annual submission to the Congress mandated by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. The law requires the President to certify that major illicit drug-producing country or a major drug transit country cooperated fully with the United States in the previous year or took adequate steps on its own with respect to illicit drug production, trafficking, and money laundering. One hearing was conducted jointly by the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations and the Subcommittee on International Economic Policy. In preparation for the hearings, the staff interviewed dozens of people in and out of government. Many of these interviews were kept confidential to ensure candid discussions. The subcommittee traveled to Costa Rica, where depositions were taken and interviews conducted with present and former government officials. By agreement with Chairman Daniel Inouye of the Senate Select Committee on Secret Military Assistance to Iran and the Nicaraguan opposition, the staff assigned to the investigation were cleared to review the documents provided to the Select Committee in the course of its investigation. The committee staff reviewed thousands of Select Committee's documents, including the classified version of notebooks maintained by Oliver North during the period he was at the National Security Council, the North Diaries. A number of witnesses and prospective witnesses were convicted felons, having been imprisoned for narcotics-related offenses. The subcommittee made use of these witnesses in accordance with the practice of federal and state prosecutors, who routinely rely on convicts as witnesses in criminal trials because they are the ones with the most intimate knowledge of the criminal activity. All witnesses who appeared before the subcommittee did so under oath and the threat of prosecution for perjury. The subcommittee did not and could not offer reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. Before using the testimony of convicted felons in a public session, the subcommittee staff attempted to corroborate the witnesses' stories. Many of the witnesses were considered sufficiently credible to have been used by prosecutors in grand jury investigations and trials, including the major federal narcotics prosecutions of General Noriega, Medellin cartel leader Carlos Leder, and officials in Haiti and the Bahamas. Gaining access to convicted felons and making arrangements to have them testify required the cooperation of the Department of Justice and numerous U.S. attorneys. In some cases, the cooperation was excellent, while in others the subcommittee confronted one difficulty after another, which delayed the investigation and complicated the presentation of testimony in public hearings. As this report is read, it should be kept in mind that the purpose of the investigation was to identify the nature of the threat posed by international drug trafficking and the adequacy of the U.S. government response to the threat. The subcommittee was interested in the larger policy questions and was not seeking to develop specific cases against individuals. The scope of the threat. When the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations began its investigation 2 years ago into drug trafficking, law enforcement, and foreign policy, this issue is widely viewed as being primarily a law enforcement problem. While public debate over the drug problem focused on improving international and domestic law enforcement efforts, the size, capability, and activities of the cartels were rapidly expanding. There are probably few issues which have caused greater strains in our relations with other nations, particularly with our Latin American neighbors, than that of international drug trafficking. The problem has given rise to a growing frustration in the Congress over the seeming inability of many nations in the hemisphere to eliminate or curtail the production or transshipment of cocaine and marijuana destined for marketing in the United States. On the other hand, there are valid concerns on the part of our Latin American allies that were it not for the demand problem in the United States, the drug issue would be of more manageable proportions. After 2 years of investigation carried out under the auspices of the Subcommittee on Narcotics, Terrorism, and International Operations, it is apparent that the United States is facing a significant national security problem. It is a problem serious enough for us to re-examine our perception as to what constitutes national security threats to ourselves and our friends around the world. In the post-World War II era, the national security focus of the United States was framed by our predominant concern with East-West competition around the globe. This concern with Marxist expansionism in general, and Soviet expansionism in particular, led us to take a series of extraordinary steps to respond to the threat. These steps ranged from implementing the Marshall Plan for Western Europe to establishing NATO and other military alliances around the world, to fighting conventional wars in both Korea and Vietnam. As the United States enters the decade of the 1990s, it is clear that the operations of the international drug organizations also constitute a threat of serious national security dimensions. In Latin America, these organizations, known as cartels, have become a powerful supranational political force with economic resources of a magnitude to shape developments in Central and South America and throughout the Caribbean. The most powerful of the Latin American drug cartels are located in Colombia. The Colombian cartels constitute an international underworld so extensive, so wealthy, and so powerful that today they operate virtually unchallenged. They have organized themselves into elaborate conglomerates for the purposes of growing, harvesting, processing, transporting, selling, and repatriating their profits from cocaine and marijuana. Men like Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, Jaime Guillot Lara, and Carlos Leder formed ocean-spanning, mafia-like organizations capable of very large and very complex undertakings. They have built coca processing centers in the nearly impenetrable rainforests of the Amazon River basin in Colombia, factory complexes capable, in a week's time, of converting tons of coca paste flown in from Peru and Bolivia into crystalline cocaine. The finished product is then flown across the Caribbean and Central America to the United States. It is estimated that there are $5 of profit for each dollar the cartels invest in the farm-to-market process. The magnitude of the profits associated with the international drug trade is staggering. The June 20, 1988 edition of Fortune magazine reported that the global drug trade may run up to $500 billion a year, more than twice the value of all U.S. currency in circulation. As witness after witness stressed to the subcommittee, the cartels are driven by financial rather than ideological motives. They are willing to do business with anyone as long as it helps further their narcotics interests. Their power threatens to undermine regional stability, and they have already demonstrated the capacity to destabilize democratic governments. These developments are deeply inimical to the national security interests of the United States. Domestic effects of international drug trafficking. To appreciate the degree to which the international drug traffickers have affected the lives of the American people, one needs only to analyze the statistics. Polls show that about 50% of all Americans say they have had a relative or close friend who has had a problem with illegal drugs, and 1 out of every 3 says that illicit drugs can be purchased within a mile of their home. In addition, 60% of all illegal drugs produced in the world are consumed here in the United States. Some 20 million Americans smoke marijuana, nearly 6 million regularly use cocaine, and 500,000 are addicted to heroin. The National Institute for Drug Abuse reports that cocaine-related hospital emergencies have risen nearly 600% between 1983 and 1987. Cocaine-related deaths have risen from under 400 in 1983 to nearly 1,400 in 1987, the last year for which statistics are available. It is estimated that 70% of all violent crime in the United States is drug-related. The street price for a kilo of cocaine in the United States has plummeted from $60,000 in 1980 to approximately $9,000 a kilo today. This has put cocaine within the means of the vast majority of Americans and shows how ineffective interdiction efforts have been. Between 1982 and 1985, the amount of cocaine seized coming into the United States more than doubled, from 31 metric tons to 72.3 metric tons. The problem has reached such crisis proportions that various federal agencies involved in the war on drugs cannot come up with a reasonable estimate as to how much cocaine reaches the streets of our country today. It is estimated that cocaine usage among the workforce costs the United States $100 billion a year in lost productivity. The American market for drugs produces annual revenues of well over $100 billion at retail prices. This is twice what U.S. consumers spend for oil each year. Effects on foreign countries. It is not only the people of the United States who are victimized by the operations of the cartels. The cartels, utilizing corruption and violence, have literally bought governments and destabilized others. In Colombia, the cocaine lords have co-opted an entire nation and its government. Beginning in 1984, efforts by the Colombian government to crack down and dismantle the cartels since 1984 have led to unprecedented violence. in the past 2 years, 57 judges, including half of the Supreme Court, and 2 cabinet officials have been assassinated. A year ago, Colombia's Attorney General was murdered by cartel assassins. While Colombia's democracy has been threatened, Panama's has been stolen. The relationship established in the 1970s between drug traffickers and a little-known officer in the Panamanian intelligence, Manuel Antonio Noriega, has grown as Noriega's power has increased. As a result, Panama has become a safe haven and critical base of operations for the cartels, particularly as a money laundering center. The trend toward democratization was reversed in Panama, and Noriega now presides over the hemisphere's first narco-kleptocracy. The corrupting influence of the cartels has now been felt throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The subcommittee received testimony that remote islands in the Bahamas chain could be rented for use as transit sites for cocaine and marijuana destined for the United States. Despite the expenditure of significant sums of money devoted to joint interdiction efforts with the government of the Bahamas, the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report of March 1988 estimated that 60% of the cocaine and 50% of the marijuana coming into the United States continued to transit that country. U.S. officials attribute the problem to the continuation of drug-related corruption at all levels of government. In 1987, the Colombian cartels established a major and secure base of operations in Haiti, turning that country into another significant transit point for cocaine coming into the United States. The cartels bought protection from the upper ranks of the Haitian military, which in turn established a distribution network in the United States. This network is characterized by a high level of violence associated with its operations. The cartels now pose a serious threat to Costa Rica, having established themselves in the northern war zones used by the Nicaraguan insurgents. Costa Rica, the most free, stable, and longest-standing democracy in the region, continues to be ill-equipped to deal with this threat, despite the fact that it has the toughest drug laws in all of Latin America. In Peru, there are reports that drug money funds the Sendero Luminoso's efforts to topple the democratically elected government of that country. In Bolivia, democratically elected governments face an almost insurmountable task in destroying coca production and cocaine labs operating with near impunity in that nation. They have corrupted local officials, including police and military, in Mexico, and there are allegations that the corruption has spread to higher-level officials. This development may be making an already serious situation worse, as Mexico continues to remain a major producer of opium poppy and cannabis, and continues to be a primary source of heroin and marijuana entering the United States. Elements of the military in Honduras are involved in drug-related corruption, undermining the fledgling attempts to establish a truly democratic, civilian-based government in that country. Because of the pervasive influence of the Honduran military on every aspect of life in that country, there is concern that the experience in Panama could be replicated in Honduras. In Paraguay, drug corruption within the military also has been a serious problem for some time. Despite the fact that Latin America's longest-standing dictator, General Alfredo Stroessner, was ousted recently in a military coup, U.S. drug enforcement officials are concerned that the narcotics trade through Paraguay will continue unabated. As the State Department has acknowledged, there are, quote, frequent allegations that Paraguayan officials are involved in narcotics trafficking, end quote. General Andres Rodriguez, the mastermind of the coup, has been linked in press reports as a major figure in the drug trade. The national security implications of the drug trade. The cartels want stable governments in Latin America, but weak institutions which they can control. They want a climate in which they can do business freely, without government interference. In many countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, they have succeeded in accomplishing this goal. In many instances, the cartels have allied themselves with organizations which are engaged in illicit movements of arms and ammunition, for whatever purpose or whatever ideology, on the right or the left. General Paul Gorman, in his testimony before the subcommittee, described the problem very succinctly when he observed, quote, "If you want to move arms or munitions in Latin America, the established networks are owned by the cartels. It has lent itself to the purposes of terrorists, of saboteurs, of spies, of insurgents, and of subversives." End quote. Such alliances have been established with left-wing insurgent groups such as M19 in Colombia and the Sendero Luminoso in Peru. General Noriega in Panama has been a major figure in the clandestine arms trade, selling weapons to anyone or group who would buy them, including the FMLN in El Salvador. As the subcommittee found, even the Nicaraguan Contras fighting to overthrow the Sandinistas were not immune from exploitation by narcotics traffickers. If allowed to continue unchallenged, the operations of the cartels will have even more serious implications for U.S. foreign policy interests throughout the hemisphere. If there has been one area of foreign policy in which the Congress and the Reagan administration found agreement during the last 8 years, it was the desirability of promoting and reinforcing the democratization process which has swept Latin America over the course of the last decade. This consensus was achieved despite the fractious debate over aid to the Contras. Other than the international debt issue, the operations of the drug cartels pose the most serious threat to the consolidation of democracy throughout Latin America. The basic foundation upon which democracy rests is respect for the rule of law and the guarantees it provides for individual rights and liberties. The cartels respect neither law, nor the rights of individuals, nor the institutions created to uphold the former and guarantee the latter. They have demonstrated the ruthless capability to undermine and destroy any institution or individual standing in their way. Unfortunately, the international narcotics trade, historically, has been relegated to the backwaters of U.S. foreign policy concerns. It was not until recent years, when domestic cocaine usage reached epidemic proportions and drug-related violence on the streets of the United States reached crisis levels, that serious attention has been paid to this problem. However, the issue is still not given attention commensurate with the seriousness of the problem within most agencies of the federal government. To date, the U.S. has been unable to achieve effective coordination regarding the problem. The Congress mandated the creation of a new position, the National Director of Narcotics Policy, informally known as the Drug Czar, in response to this concern. The Drug Czar will need to focus attention on ensuring that the U.S. develops a strategy and allocates the resources necessary to wage effectively a war on drugs. Synopsis of the report. In preparing this report, the subcommittee has attempted to define the nature of the problems associated with the operations of the cocaine cartels. There are individual chapters devoted to Colombia, Panama, the Bahamas, Haiti, Honduras, and Cuba and Nicaragua. The subcommittee had neither the time nor the resources to address other major problem countries such as Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, and Bolivia, or the emerging problems in Brazil. Nevertheless, the problems and the patterns of corruption are similar in these countries as to those addressed by the subcommittee. A separate chapter is devoted to the allegations of involvement of drug traffickers with the Contra movement and their supply operations. There is also a separate chapter devoted to the issue of money laundering, which is the key to the effective operations of the cartels. The phenomenal profit associated with the narcotics trade is the foundation upon which the cartel's power is based. The subcommittee members believe that a concerted attack on the cartel's money laundering operations may be one of the most effective means to strike at their most vulnerable point. A separate chapter is devoted to an examination of the conflicts between law enforcement agencies and the foreign policy and intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. For example, the DEA still maintains that it is receiving cooperation from Panama in U.S. drug enforcement efforts. Yet, William Von Raab, the Commissioner for U.S. Customs, has testified before the committee that by 1983, U.S. agencies had more than enough evidence of General Noriega's involvement in the narcotics trade. This, according to Von Raab, rendered any cooperation Panama was giving the U.S. in drug seizures and arrests virtually meaningless. The report also includes appendices concerning the notebooks maintained by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and their relation to the subcommittee investigation, and on allegations concerning interference by government officials in the initial stages of the subcommittee investigation. The members of the subcommittee are hopeful that, if nothing else, this report will stimulate significant debate and reflection, both within and outside our government. The stakes are very high for us and for our friends throughout the hemisphere. This entails understanding all the dimensions of the problem and the events and circumstances that contributed to the development of the cartels. After all, violence and corruption associated with the narcotics trade is not just a problem from Latin America and the Caribbean. Both seriously affect the quality of life in the United States as well. Open issues and subjects requiring further investigation. This report should be considered a first step toward a fuller understanding of the international scope of the narcotics problem. Many issues arose during the course of the investigation which could not be pursued in the 100th Congress because of the time and staff limitations. There are open issues and questions which call for further study. 1. The subcommittee investigations of money laundering allegations involving the Bank of Credit and Commerce International should be completed. Developing an effective strategy against money laundering will require a more complete understanding of the way drug traffickers move, hide, and invest the profits from their illicit activities. The subcommittee's work thus far suggests that if the banking system can be closed to drug money, and if assets owned by the drug cartels can be seized, large-scale trafficking can be more easily controlled. 2. Serious questions about the adequacy of the Neutrality Act in controlling the activities of mercenaries and soldiers of fortune arose during the hearings. The subcommittee should examine the problems the Department of Justice has had using the Act and consider its revision. 3. The subcommittee has received allegations that various factions in the Lebanese civil war are supporting their efforts with drug money and that they have started to work with the Colombian cartels. These allegations require thorough examination. 4. The subcommittee has received allegations that heroin dealers used the war in Afghanistan as cover for their operations. There are reports of guns for drugs exchanges and significant drug-related corruption. The 1988 International Drug Control Strategy Report, prepared by the State Department, obliquely acknowledged the problem, stating, quote, individual resistance elements reportedly engage in opium production and trafficking as a source of income to provide staples for populations under their control and to fund weapons purchases, end quote. Further, it has been alleged that weapons for the resistance were diverted to the international arms market. 5. The March 1989 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report again raised concerns that drug-related corruption has continued to undermine narcotics law enforcement in Mexico. The report described the emergence in 1988 of, quote, an increasing number of Colombian traffickers within Mexico involved primarily with facilitating the transshipment of cocaine to the United States, end quote. The level of drug-related corruption in Mexico continues to be a priority concern of the subcommittee. While there was neither the time nor the resources to investigate thoroughly the situation in Mexico, this will be a continuing focus of the subcommittee's work in the future. Other pending business includes the effort by the Foreign Relations Committee to obtain access to an unexpurgated version of Oliver North's notebooks. The notebooks contain numerous references to the drug issue, but could not be deciphered because key sections had been deleted by North and his attorneys. On April 6, 1989, those notebooks were turned over by North to the independent counsel in connection with his trial, when North waived his Fifth Amendment rights and chose to testify. The subcommittee will continue to seek to obtain those notebooks. A detailed discussion of the North notebook problem has been included as an appendix to this report. This is Our Hidden History,